Hey all, welcome back. Second video of lecture 5. And in this video, we're going to build off of some of the stuff we were talking about in the previous video about perfect competition. And I really want to show you concretely why that price taking condition exhibits that flat line that an individual firm faces in a perfectly competitive market. And the entire idea has to do with a concept called the residual demand curve. Okay. And so the residual demand curve is defined as the demand faced by an individual firm that is not met by other sellers in the market at any given price. Okay, so you can think about we have a ton of firms in the market, right, that are supplying a good, and we have one of those firms is sort of facing the demand that's not met by all the other sellers in the market. Okay, so let's denote the aggregate supply curve of all other firms, right, that are not this firm that we're talking about, sort of just hypothetically, as S superscript O of P. Okay? And so we can define then the residual demand mathematically as the residual demand in equation 1 is equal to the aggregate demand in a market, right? The market demand curve, minus the supply of all the other firms in the market, right? So again, to think about this intuitively, the residual demand is the demand faced by an individual firm that is not met by the rest of the firms in the market. Okay, so that's why we're taking the market demand, right, D of P, subtracting off the supply of all the other firms in the market, and what we're left with is sort of this residual demand that's faced by this individual firm we're discussing. Okay, so let's do a concrete example to solidify this point. So suppose we have a Canadian manufacturing firm producing metal chairs. Okay, let's denote firm J as the firm for which we want to derive this individual demand. Okay. Okay. And so the aggregate demand and aggregate supply of all other firms not equal to J, I'm going to show in this graph below. Okay. So here I have a price of metal chairs and a quantity produced of metal chairs. Okay. And so I have the market demand, right, for metal chairs as a downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping supply curve. But this is the supply curve of all other firms not equal to firm J, right? So firm J is the firm for which we're deriving this residual demand curve for. And so the supply of all other firms includes the supply function of all firms that are not equal to J, okay? And suppose that this graph produces an equilibrium price of $66 per chair and the equilibrium quantity of 500 chairs. Okay. Okay. So this is the graph for so this is the equilibrium for the supply of all other firms and the aggregate market demand. And so at a price of $66, what does that mean? Well, that means that the market clears with this supply curve. So that means that at a price of $66, the residual demand for firm J is zero, right? Because all the demand is met by all the other firms because the market is clearing at a price of 66. But let's say, for example, that we had a price of 63 per chair. Okay. What does that mean? Well, now we're in disequilibrium, right? Now the market is not clearing at a price of 63, and at a price of 63, the willingness to sell of all other firms, right, that are not equal to firm J, they're only willing to provide a total of 434 metal chairs. But the demand at this price is 527 metal chairs, right? So now we have a shortage in the market, right? Because at a price that's lower, all the other firms combined are willing to sell only 434 shares, but the market demands 527. So this is now where firm J, the one that's not in this market, is able to step in and provide supply to meet some of that residual demand and can help us think about how to derive that firm's residual demand curve, okay, that they face. And so with this information, I can draw now in this graph. So this graph is going to be the residual demand faced, by firm J. Okay, and so remember back to our previous graph here. At a price of 66, right, the market fully clears with just the supply of all the other firms, which means that firm J at a price of 66 is supplying. It faces a demand of 0 shares because all the demand for shares is met by the other firms, and so the residual demand faced, the leftover demand faced by firm J is 0. Okay, so I can start to form my residual demand curve by saying, okay, well, at a price of 66, again, price, quantity, at a price of 66, what is my residual demand in terms of quantity? Well, it's 0. So my residual demand is 0 here. But we showed in the previous graph also that at a price of 63, which is slightly lower than 66, now there is some leftover demand faced that needs to be supplied by firm J, right? That the market isn't clearing, we're in disequilibrium with all the other firms, and so firm J can now step in to produce something. So we know that at a price of 63 from our previous graph, that the difference, right, in sort of unmet demand is there's a demand of 527 shares, but there's only a supply from all the other firms of 434. This difference is equal to 93 shares that need to be supplied still. Okay, so that's why we have this 93 here. So now for this specific firm, firm J, at a price of 63, the demand they face for shares is 93 shares, right? And so you can see here that while this demand curve doesn't look completely flat, it looks really flat compared to the market demand curve that we saw in the previous graph. And that's because when you have a ton of firms, as you increase the number of other firms in the market, you can imagine that the residual demand faced by a specific firm is approaching a horizontal line, because no matter what that individual firm decides to do, the price associated with the market is not going to change, right? And so the way we think about this residual demand curve in this graph now is basically approaching the number of firms going to infinity, we're approaching a flat line that is basically the market price that cannot be moved by any specific firm's decision. You can see here that if firm J has a supply curve that looks like this, right? And sorry, I should label this. And for example, they decide to, something happens where maybe one of their factories like gets on fire or something, you have the supply move inward a little bit to be something like that, right? You're going from this point here to this point here, and you can see here, because we don't have an infinite number of firms and all the perfectly competitive characteristics are not fully met, but they're close, that the price only barely changes as a result of that supply change, right? And the idea is when you reach the infinite number of firms and every firm is just infinitely small and has no effect on the market share, that change is actually going to result in a zero change in the market price. Okay, so that's the idea behind basically why an individual firm in a perfectly competitive market basically is a price taker. Okay, and that was the entire idea of this exercise. So in the next video, we're going to start to talk about monopoly and how monopoly differs from a competitive market.